I interviewed a guy, it was a couple of years ago, one of the biggest stars in South America, and we're having dinner, talking, interviewing. And he was ready to kill himself, right? Hooked on drugs. And he said, I went, on the floor, I got on my knees and said, God, you need to save me. And his life was transformed. This guy was one of the biggest stars in South America. I mean, there's a list of people, the Martin Sheens, the Joe Estevez, same stories over and over, how they were ready to end their life, or they were addicted to something, and they gave their life to Christ, and their life was transformed.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Biblical Money. I'm your host, Rabbi Rami Goldberg from Israel 365. I am joined today by actually our first Catholic on the program, Craig Syracusa. We met a couple of weeks ago in Nashville. I'm so happy to have you join us today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be the first Catholic. Hopefully I won't be the last Catholic, but thank you so much for this opportunity.
So, Craig, just give us a little bit about of your background, and it was like we were talking beforehand about how connected you were to the Jewish community growing up in Brooklyn. In some ways, I think with your Brooklyn accent, you're more Jewish than I am. Growing up in New Jersey, on the other side, my parents are from Brooklyn, but the accent didn't come through. So tell us a little bit about your background, and then we'll hear about your career a little bit.
Of course. So I live in New Jersey now, in Homedale, which is sooner or later going to become a Jewish community. But I grew up in Bensonhurst at the border of Borough Park, literally like across the street. So it was more Borough Park than Bensonhurst. My neighbors were Hasidic Jewish people. I think I mentioned to you, every Friday for a while, I would go and I would help them with the lights, and they would call my family when they needed something. We were very involved in their life, and they were very involved in our life. And my mom recently, my dad passed, and my mom sold the houses that we had to our Jewish neighbors. And my brother did a lot of work with the Jewish community. I've done work with the Jewish community, did documentaries where they were involved in the, just from their perspective. So working at the Catholic Church, we always had relationships with the Jewish community. Growing up in Brooklyn, working in Williamsburg, I mean, the Jewish people were always sort of part of my life. So very integrated, very involved. Yeah, so I've always been around the Jewish people, and that's why when you and I met in NRB, it was an instant sort of connection. I want to share with you, I wrote this paper about how Homedale, where I live now, I foresee that it will become a Jewish community. And I wrote this paper that I want to submit to the town on how we need to adjust certain things to accommodate the Jewish community when they eventually move into Homedale, New Jersey. So, being on the show, like I said, it's truly an honor.
Yeah. So wonderful. So I want to get into your career a little bit. You have a career in acting and podcasting and movie production. And so give us a little bit about kind of how you got into that. Are you one of these child stars, Macaulay Culkin over here? But some of your background.
No, I wish I was. As a kid, I did actually look like Macaulay Culkin. That was funny, but I started off as an actor, and then I did okay. I didn't do extremely well, but I, joined SAG after. I did a lot of commercials, a lot of extra work. That's how we would start our career, and then got into doing some TV shows, some movies, and I did well. And then I went back to school. I wanted to learn more about directing because I always wanted to tell stories. And being an actor, sometimes I felt like I was at the mercy of other people. You could be extremely talented, but if you're not the right look, the right feel, they won't cast you. So as a director, I felt like I can always tell stories. So I got into telling stories through documentaries, which I love doing. I always would find stories. The first one I did was trying to eliminate racism through the use of breakdancing. And this was probably one of my first documentaries, had to be about 25 years ago. And I started doing a lot of documentaries and getting into TV shows and reality shows or docuseries. And I started to do really well with that. And then I just kept excelling on that. And then about 15, 16 years ago, I was always involved in the church, but I went on a pilgrimage to Fatima, and Pope Francis was at the time was speaking. And I had this experience with the Holy Spirit that was sort of like my awakening. And then I gave my life to Christ, and I was sort of so devoted to my faith that I wanted to sort of tell stories about religion and about injustice, but through the lens of me as a Catholic. So I started to create content and using the bridge and the relationships that I had in the secular world. I started my career. I worked in Entertainment Tonight. I've worked in a lot of big companies, Law and Order. I did really well, but I had this, like I said, this experience where I wanted to just devote my life to Christ. And I started creating content for the church, for the people, to inspire, evangelize, bring people to Christ, raise awareness for injustice. I've done so much content, and then I started to really just build in that, and I excelled immediately. And I knew that that's where God was calling me was into, the world of faith, and really to build this bridge. It was all about building the bridge, uniting people regardless of what we look like on the outside. We're all made in the image and likeness of Christ. So I've had a really interesting career. And it's funny because whenever I go to events and stuff and with my wife, they say, "What does your husband do for a living?" And we always just roll our eyes. I'm like, well, where do I start? Because every day is something different, something unique. And, I'm telling you, every couple of days, God puts something on my heart, and I go after it. And I've done a lot. I've published several books and children's books with my son, and documentaries and TV shows and movies. And it's been an amazing career. And every day I'm just excited to see what God has next.
Yeah. So what are some of the kind of, when you shifted from, I'm going to say, the secular world into the religious world, what's like one or two of your, I guess, is the most impactful or most enjoyable? And those may or may not be the same thing, as far as documentary or TV shows that you really
Yeah. Well,
put your heart and soul into.
one of the things I had was, when Pope Francis was visiting the United States, I think it was 2016, I had this vision, and I was talking to a friend, and I had this vision to put a mural up of Pope Francis as he visited Manhattan. And I wanted him to take a picture in front of it, a selfie. I just saw this thing, it was so vivid. So we found a wall near Madison Square Garden, and we hired a company through a billboard company to paint a mural of Pope Francis, which was a 135-foot mural on the side of a building. And everyone I told it to said, "You're crazy." My boss at the time, he said, "You're crazy." And I said to my wife, "I'm going to do it regardless of what happens, because this is a huge undertaking." And I did it. And we hired the company, we painted this mural, and nobody knew what it was, because it was, what is this? And every day people would stop and stop. And the idea was that people would stop in front of it and reflect on whatever, their life, their experience, instead of just being so tied up in their phone. And it worked. And it became this international sort of success, in the sense that people spoke about it all over the world. It became a case study. And then Pope Francis came, and it was the iconic image of his trip to America. And then I did some in Mexico near Juarez, and I started putting them all over the country, and I started putting these billboards up. And I wound up going to the Vatican to speak at an event about the power of sports. And then from that, it gave me the momentum to do a documentary on how to. It was called I'm sorry, let me start. The thesis was, is boxing a sin or a gift from God? How does a gift become a sin? So I wanted to interview every world champion. I have actually a boxer who was a rabbi who was the world champion in the film. And it talks about how boxing and sports in general could unite us all under one umbrella. And it was using boxing, and boxing was just the backdrop. So that documentary, I had every world champion and a lot of big celebrities in it, Mario Lopez, and went on to be nominated for an Emmy. That was a project, same thing, when I told people, especially in the boxing world, that I wanted to do a documentary about boxing and integrate faith. They said, "What?" And it was all started because in sports, or even award ceremonies, the first thing to do is glorify God. And I wanted to know why. And I wanted to dive into that. And that led me on that documentary. And it would be things like that God puts on my heart. And I'm like, "Okay, God, this is what you want me to do." And then the next day, the voice comes, the enemy comes, says, "You shouldn't do this. This is not the right thing. You're not qualified." And then I just pray about it, and I go after it. And when it works out, and I look back, and I'm like, I obeyed God. And I knew from the beginning, I discerned, and it was the calling from God for me to do some of these projects. Those are the two that really stick out in my life. And I've done, like I said, thousands and thousands of hours of content. I mean, currently now I'm working on probably 3 or 4 projects, at the same time.
Right. Wow. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And I guess, just as you were talking, I was like thinking about like the world of sports. I feel like the world of sports is depending on which sport, but it's a kind of more faithful endeavor than the world of Hollywood. Hollywood is like really very much devoid of God, whereas sports, I feel like a very large majority of sports players are in different levels of the spectrum, but have like a belief in God. I mean, am I onto something? Is that like
Oh,
something?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was the event at the Vatican. It was, this was a long time ago. It was like faith in sports, and so it was all the biggest leaders in sports. It was the owner of the Giants. It was the owner of the Harlem Globetrotters and athletes. And they all came into this room, and I was there, and I spoke for a little bit about boxing and about the power of sports and how we can use sports to unite people. Because like, even you watch boxing, UFC, I don't really care for, no offense, but the first thing to do is glorify God. Football, they glorify God. Basketball, they glorify God. whether it's taken out, because of the news might, take out that comment, but either way, live, they're glorifying God. And it's just, and I asked even in the boxing, like, why do they do that? Because they put their life on the line. And I think too, when they come from nothing and they work so hard and they devote everything and they pray or whatever, they know that the reason they're there is because of God, and they have to honor God. I've interviewed so many boxers, and to watch their career come from nothing to where they reach that pinnacle of success, the first thing they do is honor God. They all give glory to God because they know immediately, or if they don't, or whatever, that could be all taken away. They're so humble. And I see that throughout sports all the time. The people that I've interviewed, the first thing they do is glorify God.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thing. I was having a conversation actually with a guy, and I was talking about the NFL being a very woke, especially with the halftime show this year. I didn't even follow it so much, but it was, but he was saying that, he said, no, within your kind of the channels and the NFL itself, but the guys themselves, there are ministries on every team, and they're really, really thinking about these things and as themselves as role models, to others. And yeah, so I think that is like a very kind of interesting area. One challenge I've had, and I'm curious just to hear your take on it. I'm a hockey fan. Grew up down the road from the New Jersey Devils. They used to practice, but over the last number of years, where gambling has become legalized, it's taken what I feel is like a wholesome, Sunday afternoon into this, like, heavy gambling, and I don't know. I just feel like it's moved us in the wrong direction, and I don't know, like, if you have thoughts about that, and if there's anything that we could do about it to turn back the clocks in that.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I don't gamble. That's one thing. I rarely even use scratch offs. It's just something I just don't really appreciate at all. But if you, especially driving around New Jersey, I mean, everywhere you go, there's some sort of billboard or signage that promotes gambling. But one thing too, I watched hockey today on the highlights. The amount of fights. I mean, I just watching that alone. I can't connect to hockey for various reasons, but that especially today, there was a highlight on. There had to be about 4 or 5 fights within one hockey game. And to me, I don't think that's the right thing. But in terms of the gambling, I don't know if it's ever going to go back to the way it was. I mean, there's so much money that's made, through gambling, whether it's legal or illegal. I don't know if we can ever go back to the way it was. But it's one thing that I don't gamble on the Super Bowl. I don't gamble on any sort of sports. I've just never been one to gamble, not at all.
Yeah, no, I'm in the same boat where, my 18th birthday, I got myself like a scratch off. That was like an exciting, like, but not something that interesting. But it's something that for me, it has taken away a lot of the flavor of the game, because the game has now become, they even show, like, oh, if this guy scores in the next 2 minutes, you can make, tons of money, and it kind of seems not godly per se. So, have you been able to impact within the Hollywood scene? Meaning, you kind of, it sounds like you left your career, your secular career. Did you maintain your relationships there, and have you been able to have those impacts in, from the outside?
Yeah, I mean, I still have most of my relationships because those relationships were built on a foundation, this respect, this integrity. I've never really, yeah, I still have all those relationships. Now it's been challenging for us to create faith-based content. We could create the faith-based content within our own world, but trying to take that content and pitch it to Hollywood or sell it to Hollywood. I mean, currently now it's been one of the biggest challenges for my team and I. We've been trying to sell this film, and we have everything in place, but raising the capital has been extremely challenging, especially for us. When I say it's a Catholic priest in Vietnam, oh my God. I mean, you got the 3 strikes against you, but it's been really hard for us. So we go after, smaller companies, evangelical companies, Christian Catholic companies, production companies, but it's been challenging for us. I mean, that's the one thing. And it's not always like, they don't always say no. It's not like, you pitch a TV show or a project to Netflix and they'll say no. They'll just, most of the time for us, they'll just give us the runaround. They'll just prolong the no, the inevitable. But I've noticed, though, for me, especially whenever I attempt to pitch projects, usually it's very challenging for me, especially, like I said, if it's something that glorifies God, or if it's something that glorifies for me the Catholic Church. I've had a lot of issues trying to get projects like that made. So most of the time we create them on our own, or we create projects and we try to raise some money, or the budgets are extremely low. But I've definitely seen in my own eyes and with friends and other filmmakers, it's challenging when you try to create content that's going to glorify God and try to get it on these main big platforms. And that's why we see a lot of these platforms or these spin-offs or people that we know that are on NRB that create their own streaming platforms, because a lot of them, they have too many issues within Hollywood. I mean, I know people that have done huge films, and when I talk to them and interview them like this, and they'll say, it took me 20 years to make this movie. And I'm like, wow. And then a lot of times they'll say, we have to put up our own money. And I'm like, wow, how did you do that? I know someone recently did a film on Bonhoeffer. I mean, they put up a lot of money on their own just to get that film. Yeah, I met with them recently, and they told me the story. And I mean, I can give you hundreds of examples. The Tim Ballard story, how many years it took for them to make Sound of Freedom. I mean, Cabrini, I know them personally. It was to raise that money and get these films made. It's very challenging. And what I've learned too, like, because we had a sort of a deal, we'll call it, with one of the films, and the first thing they want to do is rewrite the script and change the script. So then you have to decide, is the money worth it? Am I going to bend? Am I going to, give up? Am I going to compromise my values? And it's no. And I have a pastor on my team, Jason, who you met, Christian, and he's like, immediately he says, we're not going to bend, we're not going to change, and he says it immediately before the meeting starts. So if the producer or the investor had any ideas that we were going to bend and make this story more Hollywood like, the conversation ends, because we will not compromise our values. And that's one of the reasons it's hard to make movies, because if I compromise, I can make anything. I can have a love interest. The priest could do this. It could, whatever you want it to be, right? And then how do I sleep at night? How do I call myself a follower of Christ? My convictions would keep me up. There isn't any amount of money that I would accept to compromise my values and my faith in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge is that so much of Hollywood has moved in that direction, where it's like, okay, we just have no values. It's become totally woke, totally anti-biblical. I've been now, every time I watch something, it's like you get through like the first season when it's like, okay, first season's pretty good. And then it's like, you get to the second season, you're like, oh, they're going anti-biblical.
Yes.
And so it just seems that that's always the way these things
Yeah,
go.
I usually tell by the third episode, I'm like, oh, I ain't watching this, because you start to see the character. So it's really hard to enjoy. But I one thing I do fear too, and I see a lot of my friends or colleagues that start these streaming platforms, and I built a TV station. I worked at a TV station, Catholic one, for a long time. And we were very strict, which I loved. We were so strict on what we would accept and what we would play. But some of these other companies, streaming platforms, you start off and you have very strict values, like we will not accept this. This is all we're going to accept. But then in order to keep the retention of the subscribers, you start bending a little bit. You bend a little more. You bend a little more. All of a sudden, you lost complete focus of what the mission was. And then you're no longer a Christian or a Catholic or a faith-based platform. You're just like everyone else. And now you're competing against Netflix. And I've seen that happen plenty of times where people, I talk to them and they say, we're going to be the Christian Netflix or the Christian this. And I'm like, I really do hope that you stay true to your values, but it's extremely hard. How do you keep the retention? How do you keep the subscribers, engaged in content? Because you're competing against something like Netflix, which has, billions and billions of dollars, and where these small not-for-profits trying to just stay afloat.
Yeah, and it's hard, even if you come out with one good film, and whatever you guys have in the Catholic world, we are, as the Jewish people, significantly smaller. I remember a couple of years ago, someone put out like a cartoon version of the book of Esther around this time of year, right before Purim. And it was like, wow, that was amazing. And my kids are like, okay, when is, I don't know, part 2, or when is the Passover story coming? And it's like, no, they had to put up whatever amount of money to get this done. So, maybe they recouped their investment, made a couple, made $5 in a cup of coffee or something like that. So
that's it, Rabbi. You do, most of these projects, when we do them, we have one now, like I said, and we're raising money, and most people, if they do ask if there's a return, I usually explain to them, like, most likely not. If you got to get involved in this project because you believe in the story, you can't get involved in some of these projects because you think you're going to make money, because usually you don't. I have a documentary now. I'm still trying to raise about, I'd say 20 to 40 grand on this documentary about mental health, and I can't raise the money. We finished the film. I can't raise the end finance to just get the editing done. We have distribution, we have everything done. We filmed it, but I can't get the 20 to 30, $40,000 to finish the editing. It's impossible, because to say to someone, the investor, you're not going to get your money back. Chances of getting your money back on a documentary is slim. Once you say that, most investors are like, okay, I'm not interested, because they want to, they want to see a return. But you have to believe in the projects. You have to believe in the work you're doing. It can't always be about money, especially when you're creating content that glorifies God or inspires people, unites people, because the money doesn't come. The money comes in other ways, right? We're glorifying God. We're helping people. That's why we do. That's why we do this.
Right. And it's so wild. If we would just turn off our Netflix accounts, that number one, there'd be so much more money for much more productive. We'd have so much more time, and could do something that's more valuable. I'm curious, just like within the, when you see different things on Netflix or whatever, how often do they get the Catholic position correct? What would you say?
I mean, I was thinking last night something similar. I'm like, there's not many Catholic films out there. There really is. I mean, I cover all of them. I'd say 90% of them I cover, right? And most of them are Christians. And that's how I've built such a Rolodex in friendship with Christians, because most of them create the films. I mean, there are some Catholic documentaries and TV shows, but most of them are Christian. And I keep thinking, why don't the Catholics come together and create high-end Hollywood type of content like the Christians do? I can only imagine. There's so many films that come out, but the depiction of Catholics, I mean, I don't really see us on TV or in films. I mean, you have the Father Stu film, which that's probably the only one the Mark Wahlberg made, and the Cabrini one, which Angel put out. I mean, but there's not many. There really isn't. And like you said earlier, your point, they'll do the Cabrini film, which was a fantastic movie, and that was 3-4 years ago. I mean, you know what I mean? When's the next one coming out? And then most of the ones that I cover, they're Catholic. If they're Catholic, they're documentaries, or they're very low budget, and they're okay, but they're not going to drive the masses to the theaters. They're not going to be something we sit and discuss and talk about. But the depiction of Catholics, I don't even see it in films. I mean, I really don't. And if you do, and if it's on Law and Order or something, it's not being depicted the right way. Not by any means at all.
Right, because we always had that, like growing up. It was like, oh my gosh, there's like a Jewish guy, and like it's like a Hasidic guy, and like he has half his beard. I don't know. They just do it all wrong, and like as an insider, obviously knowing that they've gotten it wrong, So I was like curious.
There was I can't remember. I actually shut it off. I can't remember the name, but there was a film recently took place in Brooklyn about the Hasidic Jewish. It was like a rabbi, and he was like a hitman, and it was a big Hollywood film. It was I forgot the director. I don't want to misspeak, but I couldn't watch it. It was terrible. The way they depicted Brooklyn and just the rabbi, and it was horrible. I'm like, it really bothers me the way that they sort of put out this content. But we need to counter that by putting out good quality content so people watch it and go, And I always say that as a joke to my wife. I'm like, when I go to these events and I have my Christian friends, and they'll say to me probably like, you're a cool Catholic, and I like that. It's like now they go back and say, well, you know what? I have a Catholic friend. He's not like that. He doesn't belong to a cult. He's really a nice guy, and he loves God, and he prays with us, and he's normal. You know what I mean? Like, I like that. And I think that's why God sort of put me in this position, because I belong to a lot of Christian groups and prayer groups, and it's like I feel like I'm always the Catholic, and I call myself Catholic Craig. I was in NRB a few years ago, and President Trump, it was like, already Catholics here, and I'm waving my hand. I'm over here. There was 3 of us, and it's interesting because, like I said, I feel like God put me in this position to where, he's using me in a way that I never really thought he would use me. And I love being around my Christian brothers. I love being around my Jewish brothers and just letting them know I am Catholic, and I love you. That's it.
Yeah, and I think it's so important as men of faith for us to stand together. And if we see somebody making fun of a different religious group, it's like, no, that's not okay. Meaning that is a way of worshiping God. I might not understand it. I might not agree with it. It might not be for me, but it kind of devalues the God or religion stock, as it were. And I think that's also a lot of what Hollywood has been doing, is chipping away at that that they chip away at business and they chip away at at religion. I think those are all like kind of things that we hold to be sacred. So have you, as being a director, storyteller, I mean, you're basically running your own business. And what is that like in terms of like hiring people, firing people, people not showing up when you need them? Like, what's the kind of ins and outs as I want to say, the CEO of the film? How is,
Well, it's so most of the people that work for me are all freelance, which is great. So that's I don't have to worry about hiring and firing people, but you build a team of people, and for me, it's always been just really like that loyalty, that real friendship of people that you started off, and like anything else, there's been hills and valleys, and I have a few people that work for me, and I always tell my wife like there's this like real love that I have for them because they were there when things weren't moving, and they were there when things were really taking off. I mean, I've gone through periods, this year now has really been great, but it was about 6, 7 months where business was slow, and you lose a contract, you lose another contract, and then you feel you bounce back and you stay positive, but you try to see who's going to be there for you. And unfortunately, you do need to look around sometimes and say, was this really a friendship or a transaction? And I've noticed too, I've had a lot of transactional relationships that I consider to be friends. And that's something that my wife constantly reminds me of. This is not your friend. This is an associate. This is a business partner, not a friend necessarily. They don't have the same intentions. They don't want to see you always succeed. So it's sometimes it can be lonely also because, you consider some people to be friends, and sometimes it's just there because, they want to, whether, join in or exploit you or make money from you, or just be there just to see you succeed or fail. Like it sometimes it's tricky because remember what we're creating here is stuff that glorifies God. So that's the other thing too, is that I have to make sure that you have the same beliefs that I do. Not, it doesn't have to be specifically theological beliefs, but the belief that it's something greater than myself. I'm not doing this because I want to make money. I'm doing this because God called me to do it. Obviously money is sort of is comes with the job, but I don't do this because this is just, I woke up one day and said, hey, let me start making faith-based, Christian Catholic content and write books about God. It's something that God has called me to do. So I have to make sure the people that work alongside me have those same beliefs, or at least, we're on the same path, because otherwise they won't understand why I'm doing this. Because I'm telling you, I wake up sometimes at 2, 3 in the morning with these ideas and these thoughts. And there's one now that I'm working on that, I mean, I won't share it because we didn't sign yet, but I was praying for something for a long time. And I met with Troy Miller, who I met with a lot of people telling this idea, and it just didn't really make sense. And this woman just came out of the blue. I don't even know her. And she said, I'll support you on this. And I'm still like concerned because I don't even know her. But I'm like, I can't wait until this does come to fruition, which it should in a couple of days, that I can go and glorify God and say, this was because of prayer. And when I told people this idea, they said, this doesn't even make any sense. And to see how God uses you. But to me, it's discerning, making sure I'm hearing God correctly. And then I have to also decide, like, is this glorifying me? And the minute I feel like it, like the enemy comes or the voice comes that says, you should take credit for this or you should do this, and I know that's not God, I have to pull back and reassess what I'm doing and say, okay, God, that's not the voice. That's not you. But it's challenging, I could say that. And I have God's Plan Productions. We have a TV show, Walk in Faith. I created 2 not-for-profits, which I run another one called Angels in Education with a partner of mine. We created a distribution company for books, which God's Plan Publishing. Every day it's something else that we're working on. And they're all different stages. So it's fun. You meet a lot of people. We created a tomato sauce company, an olive oil company, which goes through the not-for-profit. And every day it's something else, and it's exciting. But, like I said, when people ask you, what do you do? I don't really know what to say sometimes. I just say I'm a communicator for Christ.
Yeah, that's my mother, my brother-in-laws. I have 3 brother-in-laws. One's a doctor, one's a dentist, one's a lawyer, and then there was me. So when my mother-in-law would be asked to introduce, like, her kids, and she would just say that I worked for the Mossad, because also, like, hand in a couple of different things. I got this business. It's not as easy. Doctor, lawyer, dentist,
Yeah.
very, very easy. And there's the fourth one, which, we're just going to, so you could say you work the most out also.
I sometimes I try to find things that aren't interesting, when you meet someone, because you're like, well, how do I explain this? I say, oh, I do marketing. No, but it's okay. Nobody wants to hear anything more than that.
Exactly. So you kind of, keep it
Yeah.
under the radar. So you also have a podcast. So tell me a little bit about the podcast
Yeah.
that's going on. I know Troy Miller is our shared
We love
guest.
Troy.
There's more, but
Yeah, I love Troy. So I've been doing the show Walk in Faith for probably almost 10 years now. It started I worked in Entertainment Tonight. I was a kid, and we would interview celebrities. And I always said to myself, why can't we ask them positive, inspirational questions, these big celebrities? But that wasn't the format. That wasn't the show. And this was way before podcasts. This is, CBS days. And it's got to be over probably 20 years ago, maybe more. And it just stuck with me. And I would sit and watch all the stars, and you sort of just learn from them. And that seed was planted. And then years and years later, I was doing a documentary, and I had this started interviewing people, and then that sort of led to this show Walk in Faith. And I was really good at it because, first of all, I studied acting for a long time, Meisner, so I understand people, and then I understand directing. So I knew all of these sort of the assets to be someone that's really good at listening, because that's all it's about, is listening and being vulnerable and open and caring about the other person, not just about myself and about asking questions, is really connecting with the person, which is what I learned and what I was really good at. And that started the show Walk in Faith. And I would interview celebrities about their journey of faith. And one of my first interviews was Dr. Oz and Devon Franklin. And I asked them about the power of prayer. And they would give me questions. And most of the time I wouldn't ask the questions. Sometimes out of respect, they send me the suggested questions. But usually it was about them. And I would maybe ask about the movie or the show. And the celebrity would always say, no one's ever asked me that question. Nobody ever listens to me. Nobody cares. And they would all say this to me, whether it was on camera or off. And I would watch them, and they would open up and they would share stories, and they would cry. And it became like, and I would cry with them. And that became sort of the show, because it was more about who they are as a person, not what the studio wants them to say. They're not just a machine. They're actually a person. So that just started the show Walk in Faith, and it grew and it grew. And I've interviewed, thousands of people, biggest celebrities, CEOs, stars. And then years later, I went back to Entertainment Tonight, and I had the opportunity to work in the Canadian office for a while, and the New York office, some LA, but mostly Canada. And I interviewed stars, and the show was about good works. So it was sort of like it became this 360, where I now was back interviewing celebrities about good works. Will Smith, there was so many stars. And I'd ask them questions about, was a not-for-profit or an inspirational book. And then when I got back to the regular secular Entertainment Tonight, I would always throw in questions about God or faith, or I'd say, God bless you. And I used to say to myself, what are they going to do? Fire me? Fire me. Like, the convictions were there. And I've been doing it, and the show did really well. It was on PureFlix. It was on a lot of Catholic stations. It still runs on several stations now. But then, the whole Zoom thing, now everyone's on Zoom, and now it became a podcast and not so much a television show. But my vision and goal is to go back to what it was at some point, if I can find a network that sees the value in it. And just, I would love to continue to do the show, but on the way that it was intended, is to sit down with the person live, get to know who they are, spend a day with them, spend time with them, and let them express themselves of who they are and why they were called to do this. Because what I learned, Rabbi, was most of the biggest stars that I've interviewed, when you talk to them, they all started off, say they were, at the beginning stages of their career, they hit the pinnacle, or they really got to a point, and they were just broken. They got addicted to drugs or alcohol, or they got divorced. Something happened in their life, this critical moment, and they leaned on God. Whatever God that is, whether Jesus Christ, if they were Jewish, either way, they leaned on something. They prayed, and their life was transformed, and they never forgot that moment. And from that story, if they share that story with you, it's like it's just so inspiring. But most of the networks are not willing or even care to hear those stories. But I've heard them so many times from celebrities that are just like, yeah, I was at the end. And I didn't know. I interviewed a guy who was a couple of years ago, one of the biggest stars in South America, and we're having dinner, talking, interviewing him. And he was ready to kill himself, right? Hooked on drugs. And he said, I went, on the floor, I got on my knees and said, God, you need to save me. And his life was transformed. This guy was one of the biggest stars in South America. And I can go, I mean, there's a list of people, the Martin Sheens, the Joe Estevez, same stories over and over, how they were ready to end their life or they were addicted to something and they gave their life to Christ and their life was transformed. Those are the stories that I want to tell, not the stories about, oh, tell me about the film. And that's great. But everybody asks those questions. And how is that going to inspire someone else? The inspiration comes from the journey, from their life, from their personal stories. And that's what I share on Walk in Faith. And that's why I built these relationships. And that's why it's been successful in the sense because it brings people to Christ, it inspires people, and it allows the celebrity to tell their personal story, not just the story the studio wants them to tell.
Wow, that's great. I mean, so much of my reason for doing this podcast is also bringing God into the boardroom and kind of speaking with people. You've now inspired me to ask, and because kind of start winding down. But what was that moment for you that kind of transition your to bring your walk in faith? So.
Yeah, I get always with the years, right? As you get older, you forget. But I was on a pilgrimage filming a documentary. So I did a reality show with Mark Cuban. He was my boss at the time, right? We were filming this really lowbrow reality show. I was working Entertainment Tonight. So I was in the secular world. I was doing reality show pitches. That's what I did every day. And I was filming a documentary about kids that were going on this pilgrimage to I guess, find Christ. And I was filming their transformation. And I went to Fatima, where Mary appeared. It was an apparition that happened. I didn't know anything about it. And I had this experience of the Holy Spirit. And I was young. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't on drugs. I wasn't influenced. I was just there filming. And this experience happened where I knew it was God. I knew it. And I always had faith in my life because I grew up in the church, but I didn't know who Jesus was. I was Catholic and all that. And I didn't know who he was, though. I just heard of him. So I just stayed on the pilgrimage, and other things happened during that journey to where God was winking in a sense that said, that he's been chasing me this whole time. So when I went back home, I emailed this Catholic company saying, hey, this is what happened to these kids when we were away, because so many things happened, and I wanted them to cover the story. And when we were in, I think it was Spain, the local network covered me and the story that took place and this experience and everything. So I knew they should be interested, and they ignored me. And I emailed them again. They called me in, and I explained what happened, and they offered me a job. And I said, "Ooh, I don't know, a job? I'm working, doing these TV shows, and I'm making money." And I prayed about it. My wife's like, "You should take the job." Like, we just got married. I just finished the feature film, and I did. I walked away from everything, which was crazy because we were in the middle of the second season of this TV show. And I was like, what am I going to do if I get this second season now? Now it goes back to what I said. Do I compromise my values? It's a lot of money. And he didn't renew the show. I think he sold the network at the time. But I was the director of the show. I was writing the show. I was doing everything, producing the show. So I would have had to go back, right? I mean, I was obligated in a sense. And I left on a Friday, Entertainment Tonight. We worked with the Jersey Shore. And I started working at the church on Monday. And everyone was like, what? You're going to work in the church? And it was the hardest transition of my life. And I would stare at this statue every day of God, and I would think about Jesus, and I would think about Mary, and I would just every day, just one step at a time, because I thought they would accept me because I was this cool guy from, Manhattan, and they didn't. And that's what sort of transformed me to who I am today, because it was very difficult and very challenging. And I knew that God put me there for a reason. But that fire that was ignited that day in Fatima continues to burn. And I think having those experiences of the secular world and meeting people allows me to, one, communicate with them now, call them up, but also communicate with everyone. So it's like my voice, my style, my accent, my experience, it resonates with a certain type of person. And that's who God is calling me to communicate to. If I was just supposed to be the theologian that, grew up in the church, and then I would have been that person. But God called me to be the Italian guy from Brooklyn who has a heavy accent, who goes to the gym and, had worked in the secular world and loves Jesus and loves to talk about him. And that's it. And that's me.
That's amazing. I mean, that's they do talk about what is, that Moses was able to say that he was the humblest man who ever walked the earth, right? And how is it possible that he could be so humble when he was writing that about himself, right? So knowing who you are, knowing what your relationship is, knowing that there's a God above. So, but anyway, just an amazing story. And if I can end off with a blessing, God should just continue to bless all of your efforts and to give you continued success, and for you, your marriage, for your family, and for you to continue to inspire many others that continue to follow you in everything that you do.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's honestly a blessing to speak with you, and I look forward to this relationship and hopefully visiting you in Israel at some point.
Okay, God bless. Bring it on. As soon as these rockets finish, and by the time this comes out, this will all be behind us, and we'll be dancing through the streets of Jerusalem together.
I hope so. God bless you, brother.
God bless.